Yeah, I think I better get a pen. Right. Testing, testing, testing. Can you hear in the back? Yes, you can. Okay. Well, welcome to Dixie, Bohemia, 1925 New Orleans, and the life of William Faulkner. Um, Somehow, some of the things are not working up here that used to work, so bear with me. And I know that many of you have attended my lectures before, and you know that they're not always linear. Uh, I tend um, to go off on tangents, many of them architectural, uh, but this one's going to be a bit different in that it's somewhat autobiographical, and then there's a lot of Oxford, Mississippi gossip. Much of it's salacious and not fit for young people. I don't see any in the audience, so you're all old enough to hear this stuff. Um, but even though it's not linear, I promise you, if you stay until the end, which may be more than an hour, um, William Faulkner's going to die. Okay, okay. Um, and I also should caution you that if you came expecting uh, a serious literary analysis of any of William Faulkner's books, you're in for a disappointment. I actually could do that, but that's not what you're getting today. So if you did come for that, you may ask Pam for a refund. Uh, now, I've put this particular um, picture on. Actually, it's a page, an ad from a recent last month's Smithsonian advertising a cruise on the Mississippi, because I do think it puts everything that we're going to be talking about today into context. Uh, and much of what is special about Mississippi is a matter of geography. Um, its location along the Mississippi River um, and the river's famous delta. Physically, it stretches south from its northern boundary of Tennessee to the Mississippi Gulf Coast in Louisiana. It's entirely banded on the east side by Alabama. In 1935, Greensville, Mississippi author Donald Cohn famously wrote, it's been reproduced many times, the Mississippi Delta begins in the lobby of the Peabody Hotel in Memphis and ends on Catfish Row in Vicksburg. Well, psychologically, I would say that Mississippi begins in the lobby of the Peabody Hotel in Memphis and ends in the lobby of the Pontchartrain Hotel in New Orleans. And until 1964, these lobbies were bridged by a third lobby, that of Jackson, Mississippi's Robert E. Lee Hotel. Here, Mississippi legislators and lobbyists mingled over cocktails that were quite illegal, because it was not until 1966, 2 years after the hotel's closure, that Mississippi, uh, as a state, repealed its statewide prohibition law. It was the last state to do so, and I know that well because my family obtained the first liquor license in Lafayette County for their Holiday Inn, and I had to get fingerprinted so I could pinch hit as a barman. Uh, And you may be surprised to hear that I've had to be fingerprinted twice to serve on the Okamic Board of Directors. And apparently that's because we have a bar in the building. Uh, well, the Robert E. Lee Hotel's owners, the Gamels, uh, closed it down in 1964 rather than admit African Americans as required by the new Civil Rights Act. And a member of the Gamel family, who had been my military school classmate and friend, later confided to me that the family had probably acted too hastily. In any event, they closed it, sold it to the state, renovated as a state office building, but it's still called the Robert E. Lee. Well, on the screen, as I say, you're seeing a map, and I'm starting with it because it does provide such geographical context. It shows Memphis, Greenville, Homus House, and New Orleans, all on the river. And then by hand, I've written in Oxford over on the right, which is inland, and about 70 miles southeast, I guess, of Memphis. And of course, Oxford is Faulkner's Jefferson. The county seat of Faulkner is Yoknapatawpha County, which was actually Lafayette County, mispronounced there just as it is in the county to the north of us, where Mayo is the county seat. Well, on the map, look first for Homus House, which is just north of, just south of Baton Rouge. Let's see. And this is Homus House. If you saw Betty Davis and Olivia de Havilland in Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte in 1964, you may recognize the house because this is where it was filmed. It was more derelict at the time, but this is Homus House. And I was 12 years old when I first visited Louisiana, and it was 1945. World War II had just ended, and gasoline was once again available for pleasure travel. This was a pilgrimage with my father, who in 1906 was born at Homus House Plantation. Not in this house, but in a typical Louisiana raised Creole cottage since demolished. My grandfather was the plantation's overseer from the late 1800s until its owners, the Miles family, went bankrupt in 1918. And at that point, my grandfather brought the family back to his native Humboldt, Tennessee, where I was born and raised. But in 1945, Homus House was owned by a bachelor doctor in New Orleans, Dr. George Crozat, and he spent every penny he made on the maintenance of this property with the goal long term of retiring in the house. But again, you can imagine the maintenance of such a property. And even though he was spending all his money on it, it still looked pretty derelict, as it did in Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte. Sadly, Dr. Crozat died shortly before he could retire to his beloved Homus House, and he willed it to nieces and nephews who sold it in 2003 to an entrepreneur who immediately sold off all the notable collection of Louisiana-made antiques and made it into an events venue. So today, Homus House as you can see on the map, it's a regular stop on the Mississippi River cruises. And it houses 3 restaurants, a bar. You can take tours of the mansion. There are overnight accommodations and some of the dependencies, or you can get married here. So it's probably in better shape physically than it's ever been. Interestingly, and probably understandably, not once on the website promoting visits to historic Homus House is there mention of the slaves who made the 12,000-acre plantation possible. Homus House Plantation had the largest number of enslaved individuals in the state of Louisiana, almost 1,000 men, women, and children. Although I knew little about architecture, when at age 12 I first saw Homus House, I loved what I saw, and I later learned was the Temple Greek form inspired by the Parthenon. Well, the Parthenon in Athens. Back up. Temple Greek. It's a great photo. It's not mine. I later came to know Natchez well, co-drafting the Historic Preservation Ordinance for the city in 1990. And there, I fell in love in 1959, my first visit there, with Dunleith. Dunleith was built in 1855, some 25 years after Homus House. But once again, you see the Temple Greek form, which is my favorite form of neoclassicism. More than 60 years later, an architect named Paul Rudolph, whose name you may know, the person in the front, Richard Jones, knows it because he's actually been to this house. But Paul Rudolph, who's usually associated with the Sarasota School of Architecture or the brutalism of the Yale School of Architecture building, which he designed while he was dean there. But he built his own stunning version of the Temple Greek mansion in Athens, Alabama. It's called the Wallace House. It's hard to believe that this modernist interpretation of the Southern Greek Revival architecture was designed at the same time he was designing the brutalist architecture building in New Haven. It's probably the most hated building on campus. But he did. And the interior has a beautiful sweeping staircase that could be in a antebellum mansion. Again, it's just remarkable. So at Homus House, see if I'm there. At Homus House in 1945, my attention was also drawn to two little buildings, and you can see them. You can see one much better than the other on either side of the red brick 1774 French house. These are garçonnières, which were built to house the family's boys when they reached their teenage. Sometimes they were used to house bachelors who came to balls at Homus House. And many years later, in 1982, I returned to Homus House for an in-depth architectural tour. And this time I was armed with the credentials of a member of the Board of Advisors of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, so they paid attention to me. And at that time, it was still owned by the nieces and nephews of Dr. Crosat, and they had opened it for tours, but it was not this sleek 3 restaurants, 1 bar, and so on place. Still had the antique furniture in it. But my big surprise was that Homus House is actually 2 historic houses, best appreciated with this aerial view. Until that 1982 visit, I had no idea there was a second house behind the Temple Greek house. It's referred to as the French house. Again, it was built in 1974 when the plantation was first developed, and the land was bought directly from the Homus Indians. Um, it's built of brick and cypress, features 18-inch thick walls. And for those of you who took my course on Palladianism, you will immediately recognize the feature on the second floor there is a Palladian window. Even though Palladio had died in 1580, his influence was enormous throughout the antebellum architecture of Louisiana. So there you see it um, with the garçonniere on either side. Um, the original house, um, God, covered that. Just between the two houses, or the new house, the 1829 house, is positioned just a few yards in front of the original French house. So there's a covered carriageway between the two, which exposes original cypress beams and rafters and joins the two houses. The large pitched roof um, is pierced by 7 classical pilastered arched dormers. The roof is crowned with, as you can see, a grand cupola and belvedere, and this allows a view of the Mississippi River. If you were in the lower levels of the house, you would never see the river because of the levee that protects and separates it. Well, later on the same trip, we made what today is the 1 hour drive by car to New Orleans. By boat, the twists and turns of the Mississippi River make for a much longer trip. New Orleans was an incredibly exotic place for this untraveled country boy. All these years later, and after too many visits to New Orleans to count, New Orleans still stands out in my travels as unique. 6 years after that first New Orleans visit, as an English lit major at Vanderbilt between 1951 and 1955, I came to appreciate New Orleans as Dixie's Bohemia during the decade of the 1920s. It was the South Sands at the New York's Greenwich Village or the left bank of Paris. New Orleans, there's Garçonniere up close. um, the this is dead center for historic New Orleans. Um, it's part of the Vieux Carré, and Vieux Carré and St. Louis Cathedral really are its epicenter. Certainly they were in 1925, and they still are. And a young William Faulkner arriving there about the 1st of January of 1925, rented an upstairs apartment from Tulane, there we go, from Tulane architecture faculty member William Spratling, who incidentally could handle a course all on his own. But Faulkner rented the upstairs of this small building on Pirates Alley. And it's right off Jackson Square. And since 1990, the house on Pirates Alley has served as the Faulkner House of Books and the headquarters of the Pirates Alley Faulkner Society. And for some of my friends, it joins Square Books in Oxford as the holy grail of bookshops. I, of course, had come to know the writings of William Faulkner well while at Vanderbilt, and how could I not, since he was the darling of the Southern agrarians who dominated the English faculty and whose membership overlapped with the fugitives. I also came to know how authors in Oxford and the Mississippi Delta dominated Southern literature. Aside from Oxford, Greenville, Mississippi was the hotbed of this activity. Some of you may know Greenville as the real home of the failed Jacksonville-based Steinmart department store. In 1908, Russian-born immigrant Sam Stein opened a general merchandise store in Greenville, right on the river. He had arrived by riverboat in 1905. In 1964, his son Jake opened the first Stein Mart there, and his grandson Jay moved the corporate headquarters to Jacksonville in 1984, where he died in 2020, much to my regret. Others of you may know Greenville as the home of the progressive Delta Democrat Times, begun by Harding Carter II in 1938. He won a Pulitzer Prize in 1946 for his editorial columns. I know Greenville best for the Percy family and their writings, among them my favorite, Lanterns on the Levee, William Alexander Percy's 1941 bestseller. And this was his memorial to the South of his youth and young manhood. It's really a Faulknerian saga. And I'll go back if I possibly do it. This is Percy, and this was the home he lived in Greenville. William Alexander Percy's father, Leroy Percy, had been a U.S. Senator, and in 1922 began openly campaigning against the Ku Klux Klan. His son, Will, here, joined in this fight. I might say that Will had interesting credentials. He was third generation in his family to go to Sewanee, the University of the South, and then went to Harvard where he got his law degree. So he was back home practicing law, and he joined his father in this campaign against the Ku Klux Klan, which was an extraordinarily brave thing to do in Mississippi in 1922. And as a result of this, Greenville never saw the rise of Klansmen into the seats of local power. Well, the family is also known for suicide. And Will's grandfather committed suicide in 1917. In 1912, his brother and only sibling died in a rifle accident at home at the age of 10, which I do not think was a suicide. His first cousin, Leroy Pratt Percy, committed suicide in 1929, as did likely his wife 3 years later when she drove her car off a country bridge into Deer Lake near Leland, Mississippi. Well, at that point, William Alexander Percy, who had never married, adopted his first cousin's 3 children. The oldest, Walker Percy, published The Moviegoer in 1961, winning the U.S. National Book Award that year. Ironically, it was never a movie. So this is the saga of only one of many, many literary families in Greenville, but it sounds like Faulkner wrote it. Turning fiction into fact, William Alexander Percy, and his lifelong Walker Percy, William Alexander's adopted child. Walker Percy and his lifelong best friend, Shelby Foote, whose name you likely will know, and was also from Greenville. They were best friends for life. And from Greenville as high school students, high school seniors, they drove to Oxford to meet William Faulkner. No doubt the families had known each other, so it was not just a drop-in. But Foote reported that Walker Percy was so in awe of Faulkner that he never uttered a word while they were there, while Foote and Faulkner carried on an animated conversation. Well, elsewhere in the Delta, Tennessee Williams was growing up in Clarksdale, also on the river. Um, and this is supposed to be the original colors of the house where he was born in Columbus, Mississippi. It's now a house museum and visitor center. But his father was a ne'er-do-well shoe salesman, and very quickly he and his mother moved to Clarksdale, and he was really raised in um, his Episcopal minister grandfather's home. But I'm sure many of you've seen many of Tennessee Williams plays, and unsurprisingly, uh, they have a flavor of decadent Mississippi. Um, and so this is Elizabeth Spencer, one of my favorites, who was born and raised until she was college age in Carrollton, Mississippi, which is on the very eastern edge of the Delta, or actually up the hill from the eastern edge. And I've shown here this incredible library that was accessible to her. It's a private library that was built in 1877 on the grounds of an antebellum home. Um, it now belongs to the state of Mississippi, but she spent many of her early years hidden away in this library. Her 1960 novella, The Light in the Piazza, which was set in Rome and Venice, Rome and Florence, published, provided the story for one of my favorite movies, A Light in the Piazza. And if you've never seen it, I urge you to do so. Olivia de Havilland plays the lead role, but it's a charming, charming story and filmed in beautiful places. Elizabeth died at age 98 in 2019. And her third novel, which was begun in Florence in 1957, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction in 1957. But for some reason, the prize ultimately was not offered that year. Now I need to back up. Here. Yeah. I got this out of sequence, but this is, you may recognize as Eudora Welty. And Eudora Welty was Elizabeth's mentor. Eudora was about 10 years older than Elizabeth. And although Eudora's home is located in North Jackson, Mississippi, she's not very far from the eastern edge of the Delta. And in common, Eudora and Elizabeth both attended Belhaven College. Now, Eudora went on to graduate from the University of Wisconsin, but they had so much in common. And Eudora's home is a National Historic Landmark today. I happened to be on the landmark committee when we designated it, and so I then went to visit it. Her niece showed me around the house and garden, and it's a time warp. She left it to the state with everything in it. It's a delightful visit if you're in the Jackson, Mississippi area. I think that even though she wrote a number of novels, my favorite, Welty, is a short story, Why I Live at the Post Office. And if you don't read anything else, read that. I'm going back now. Okay, now we come to Stark Young. Stark Young was born in Como, also in the Delta. But this is the home he lived in when he was at Ole Miss and was teaching at Ole Miss. In 1934, he published a very successful novel, So Red the Rose. But bad timing on his part. because it was eclipsed by another novel about the South's lost cause theme the next year, Gone with the Wind. But back to Faulkner, who was busily writing in both Oxford and Hollywood in 1935. In 1952, I wrote my first paper analyzing the Faulkner work on the novel, his third, Sanctuary, which was published in 1931. My paper was titled Sadism in Sanctuary. I had just returned from Paris, bringing with me a copy of the Marquis de Sade's 1791 novel Justine, illegally. And if you do nothing else, read Wikipedia's entry on the Marquis de Sade, you simply cannot believe it. You simply cannot believe it. He truly was the most immoral person I have ever encountered. But I loved reading his unexpurgated books. And on one occasion, let's see, not too long ago, I sought out his family home in Provence. He was frequently in prison or exiled to this family home lots of times, although he eventually died in the mental institution Charenton in the suburb of Paris. Yeah, this is the cover of the first edition of Faulkner's Sanctuary that had all kinds of impacts on him and obviously me. So this book, Justine, could not have been imported into the United States until 1959 because it would have been considered obscene, along with other titles such as D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, which I had read expurgated, and Henry Miller's Tropic of Capricorn. I was in law school in 1959 when a federal judge in New York shook the publishing world by rejecting such censorship, basing it on First Amendment grounds. And this decision did not go to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it was upheld on appeal in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, a case a few years later against Grove Press fully opened the floodgates. The style of the case was Grove Press versus Robert K. Christenberry, individually and as postmaster of the city of New York. Well, Grove Press in early 1959 had published an unexpurgated version of Lady Chatterley's Lover. The U.S. Post Office Department confiscated copies sent through the mail, and the issue was joined. Suddenly, Robert K. Christenberry was a celebrity. For other students in my law class, his name meant absolutely nothing. I had actually met the man in 1951. He was a legend in the small West Tennessee county where we both grew up, although he was 34 years my senior. Interestingly to me, he had gotten his start in the hotel business as a deputy hotel commissioner here in the state of Florida. But he soon moved to New York City and for 20 years managed the Astor Hotel on Times Square. No doubt some of you have stayed there. It was the place to stay if you were going to the theater. And it was a given that any Gibson County on visiting New York City would stay at the Astor, and I did in 1951 on a trip celebrating my military school graduation. Bob Christenberry had become a player in the New York world of politics, and in 1958, he was appointed the city's postmaster, a position he held in 1966. And that, of course, is how his name came to be attached to this landmark case. Had Sanctuary been first published in Europe, it likely would not have been admitted into the United States until Bob Christenberry lost his case in 1959. Which direction we're going in? Well, regressing now to the 1920s and New Orleans, Dixie Bohemia's heyday and William Faulkner owed much to Sherwood Anderson's presence there. You may not recognize Sherwood Anderson, but this is what he looked like. In the wake of his hugely successful Winesburg, Ohio, published in 1919, he spent part of the winter of 1921 in New Orleans, and he was so charmed by the lifestyle he found there that in 1824 he decided to move to New Orleans full time. And he moved into an Upper Pontauba apartment with his third wife and a son. The building housing the apartment is one of a pair constructed in 1849 by the wealthy Baroness Pontauba as a center for the city's social elite. Very quickly, the Andersons' Pontauba apartment became host to what was dubbed the Algonquin Roundtable South. 2 years later, the Andersons, by now tired of New Orleans heat and humidity, abandoned the city for the mountains of Virginia. But Sherwood's New Orleans legacy lived on in terms of his influence on William Faulkner. With the money he had saved during his 2 years as the University of Mississippi postmaster, in 1925, Faulkner decamped from Oxford and became first a guest and then a frequent visitor at the Andersons' Upper Pontauba apartment. Sherwood Anderson recalled that when Faulkner first showed up at his door, he was wearing an overcoat that bulged strangely, so much so that at first glance, Anderson thought that in some way Faulkner must be deformed. Faulkner informed Anderson that he intended to stay in the city for some time and asked if he could temporarily leave some things at Anderson's apartment. His things consisted of large jars of Lafayette County moonshine stored in the pockets of his big overcoat. And of course, when you think of overcoats in New Orleans, that may be a surprise, but it can be very cold and damp in New Orleans in December and January. Well, Faulkner was known as the poet of corn liquor, among other things, and he would eat beignets, breakfast on beignets at the French market with a glass of corn liquor. And throughout his life, Faulkner's favorite cocktail was the mint julep, but he also favored both hot and cold toddies. And I can give you his recipe for his hot toddy if you need it. Sherwood Anderson's influence on Faulkner was enormous. Faulkner praised Anderson, and this is the most convoluted sentence I have ever read, but it's very typically Faulkner. Faulkner praised Anderson as, quote, a writer who brought a new tremor of feeling, a new sense of introspectiveness to America in Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio. His fumbling for exactitude, the exact word or phrase within the limited scope of a vocabulary controlled by a fetish for simplicity, to seek always to penetrate to thought's uttermost end. How about that? So that's what Faulkner thought of Anderson. Well, the structure of Winesburg, Ohio, and Faulkner's work after following Anderson's advice to return to Oxford and write about what he knew is strikingly similar. Winesburg, Ohio is a cycle of 22 short stories centered in the background of a simple, of a single small community, the fictional town loosely based on Anderson's childhood memories of Clyde, Ohio. Each of the stories shares a specific character's past and present struggle to overcome the loneliness and isolation permeating the town. Well, the fetish for simplicity Faulkner found in Winesburg, Ohio, was also acknowledged by Ernest Hemingway as a major influence. Well, Anderson was directly responsible for the subject matter of Faulkner's second novel, Mosquitoes, which was published in 1927. The novel was inspired by a boat trip from New Orleans to across Lake Pontchartrain to Mandeville. A boatload of Bohemians, among them William Faulkner. On the Ides of March 1925, the Josephine set sail. Almost immediately, the day darkened, drizzle began, and a tropical storm rumbled in the distance. The engine started to smoke and miss, steadily losing power. Although stranded, they were close enough to the shore that swarms of mosquitoes found them. The partygoers took refuge in the main cabin, saved only by the vast quantities of illegal booze. Prohibition, of course, was in full swing. Faulkner, at last, or at least, had his inspiration for Mosquitoes, subtitled on the cover, A Brilliant Novel of Bohemian Life. Well, although Faulkner left New Orleans for Paris after 6 months, he soon returned to New Orleans and then home to Oxford following receipt of a letter from Anderson encouraging him to return to his native Oxford. Faulkner actually was not a native of Oxford. He was born in New Albany, but his family moved to Oxford in 1902 when he was 5, so people kind of overlooked that in talking about his native Oxford. Well, Faulkner heeded Anderson's advice, making the now well-known statement of writing about his own, quote, postage stamp, unquote, of soil. Oxford became Jefferson. Lafayette County became Yoknapatawpha County. Anderson's advice to Faulkner is remarkably similar to that editor Maxwell Perkins gave to Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. Write about what you know, Cross Creek. She followed his advice, and a Pulitzer Prize for the Yearling in 1938 was the result. Faulkner had first left Oxford in 1918 to live at Yale with his friend and mentor Phil Stone, a Yale law student, who was 4.5 years older than Faulkner. So Faulkner was not attending school at all. He was just living with Phil. Later that year, he postured as a veteran flyer in the Royal Flying Corps of Canada, a lie that eventually caused a rupture in his friendship with Sherwood Anderson. No talk about Faulkner would be complete without exploring his relationship with Phil Stone. That's Faulkner at the time. This is the boatload of Bohemians. And this is Faulkner with Phil Stone in later years. I couldn't find a young picture of them together, young. The reason I have to talk about this is Phil's wonderful loft. It's just off the square in Oxford. The last time I was there, it was still standing, but I was in there 2 or 3 times, and I just find it a charming example of Victorian architecture. So, from the summer of 1914, when Faulkner and Stone first met until the end of 1927, the two were mutually dependent, each one enthralled observer to the other's vivid actor. And then it was over. Although Faulkner and Stone remained friends with varying degrees of closeness for the rest of their lives, with Faulkner even mentoring Phil's son Philip, Faulkner's godson, as a writer, the nature and intensity of their relationship changed completely with Faulkner's success. Although Faulkner's great-grandfather, William Clark Faulkner, lived from 1825 to 1889 and spelled with no U in Faulkner, known in the family as the Old Colonel, is the inspiration for an integral part of the history of Faulkner's fictional Yoknapatawpha County, serving as the model for the character Colonel John Sardis. It was overwhelmingly Phil Stone and his family who served as Faulkner's models. As Southern aristocrats, the old Colonel's descendants had failed. But before elaborating on the Stone family's contribution, I have to talk a little bit about the old Colonel. The old Colonel served as a first lieutenant in the 1846 Mexican-American War. When the Civil War broke out, he raised a company of men and was made colonel in the Confederacy's 2nd Mississippi Infantry. During Reconstruction, he was active in rebuilding northern Mississippi and founded a railroad. He was also an author whose most famous book, The White Rose of Memphis, a novel published in 1881, was popular enough that it was reprinted into the 20th century, and it sold over 160,000 copies, which is a substantial number for the time. The old Colonel had just been elected to serve in the Mississippi legislature when in 1889, he was gunned down on the square in Ripley, Mississippi by a former business partner, and he died the next day. But the old Colonel himself was no stranger to violence, and he had twice been tried and acquitted on charges of murder. So, this gives you a lot to work with. But it wasn't enough for Faulkner. So he really needed to appropriate that of Phil Stone, at least he thought so. And apparently Faulkner was so enamored of Phil that he actually appears as attorney Gavin Stevens in Sanctuary, Light in August, Go Down Moses, Intruder in the Dust, Requiem for a Nun, and The Town, as well as several short stories. So Faulkner turned to the Stone family history for almost 3 decades. And it was the Stone family history, with its 19th century generals and 20th century lawyers and bankers and their antebellum mansions and Delta hunting lodges, that provide Faulkner an example of a fulfilled dynasty he could only envy and appropriate in his fiction. Well, sadly, Phil Stone's later life was nothing to be envied. In 1930, his father's bank failed. The Stones were financially ruined, and Phil, this is typically Old South, I suppose, felt honor-bound to assume his father's debts. In 1935, Phil, at age 42, married for the first and only time. His bride, Emily, was 16 years younger than he. Stone, his wife, and his widowed mother lived together in the elegant antebellum mansion that Phil's father had bought in 1893 when the Stones moved to Oxford. The mansion was destroyed by a fire in 1942. The family moved into a former tenant house across the street from the ruins. It was here that I often saw the Stones, whose daughter Araminta was my young stepsister's closest friend. I often dropped her off and picked her up at the Stones in their tenant house. Already Phil was sick, and symptoms of his finally debilitating paranoia were in evidence. In 1963, a few months after the death of his friend Bill Faulkner, he was committed to a state mental institution in Jackson, Mississippi, where he died in 1967. His male line ended with the suicide of his son, Philip, Faulkner's godson, at age 25. As a Harvard freshman, his novel, No Place to Run, had been published. So can you imagine a more Faulknerian story? After Phil's death, his widow, Emily, after far too many drinks, speculated on a homoerotic relationship between Phil and Bill. Well, my life in Oxford came as a great surprise. During the summer of 1954, while on a midshipman cruise to Europe in the battleship New Jersey, I received a telegram from my divorced mother saying she was remarrying as soon as my cruise ended. A follow-up letter described a whirlwind romance with a native of Oxford, Mississippi, whom she had met in Biloxi. Although Oxford at the time had even fewer residents, permanent residents, around 4,000, than the small town of Humboldt, Tennessee, where I was born and raised, I was immediately plunged into a far more interesting intellectual world. A large part of the intellectual excitement was due to the presence of William Faulkner, who only 5 years before, in 1949, had won the Nobel Prize for Literature, thus becoming a, quote, prophet in his own country, unquote, or perhaps more accurately, his own county, the mythical Yoknapatawpha County. This award created a lasting literary industry in Oxford. And this year, 2024, marks the 50th anniversary of the annual Faulkner and Yoknapatawpha Conference, sponsored by the University of Mississippi in Oxford. And it is a huge deal. Julianne found a photograph of me that I had never seen before, which I have to share with you. This was my stepfather's antebellum home on the upper left. And in the 1960s, they decided to give it to the local historical society, but it had to be moved. Below the top picture, you can see it in its second location, but you can see it being moved. They built a wall, split it right down the middle, built that wall, and then moved it into two sections and plopped it down on the foundations of a similar house that had been built in the 1850s but had burned. That person gave the lot and my family gave the house. But I can see my mother sitting in a chair, my stepsister standing just to her left, our cook, and then my stepfather, all watching the move of the house. And again, I'm so indebted to Julianne because I had never seen this. I was not there at the time. I was teaching here in Gainesville. So I would not be presumptuous enough to say that William Faulkner was my friend. He was an acquaintance, and sometimes he greeted me by name on the streets of Oxford or in the post office. Other times he walked right by, lost in his own world. My mother and stepfather were Oxford, who was an Oxford native, were friends of the Faulkners, occasionally partying together, most notably at a New Year's Eve celebration at the Faulkners' antebellum home, Roanoke. A rainstorm during the party turned the long, unpaved driveway to the house into a quagmire, reminiscent of that in Faulkner's last novel, my favorite, The Reivers. Guest cars were pulled out of the mud by Faulkner's beloved pair of mules. Although only a few years older than my stepfather, Faulkner had served as his Boy Scout master until Faulkner was removed from his position in 1931 with the publication of his novel Sanctuary. Uh, it's still kind of a shocker if you've never read it. My stepfather fondly recalled the tales Faulkner told around the campfire. My last direct contact with Faulkner occurred at a large wedding party where my sister Jane and I had been asked to keep the guest register. And Faulkner asked me how he should sign it. I replied, any way you like, and he signed it Prince Philip of Milan. Don't know where he came up with that, but he had a sense of humor. Well, although only an acquaintance of Faulkner, I became a good friend of his mother, who everyone called Miss Maud. And this is Miss Maud in later years. And the other, I wish it were clearer, but it's a fantastic photograph of her, probably around 1918. She was a tiny, of course, William was only 5'5", but she was 4 something, I don't know. She was very feisty. And although accounts differ, some say it was she who put the U back into the family name in 1918. But soon after my Oxford life began, I learned that Miss Maud was the Grandma Moses of Oxford. And over the last 6 years of her life, I often commissioned her to do oil paintings as wedding gifts. These commissions always involve visits and descriptions of Billy's latest activities. And on one occasion, I had just seen a newspaper photo of Faulkner in connection with a fall from his horse, resulting in a broken arm. A pint of whiskey was prominently sticking out of the pocket of his ubiquitous tweed jacket. And when I inquired of Miss Maud how he was doing, she replied, "Oh, he's feeling no pain." And I was quite sure he was not. Uh, I was particularly charmed by 2 small paintings in her dining room. Um, they were of the black woman the family called Mammy Callie, and whose proper name was Caroline Barr. I asked Miss Maud if she would copy them for me, and she agreed to do so. Well, when I picked them up, she had even copied the original date of 1941 on them. And it was not long after she delivered these that she died in October of 1960. But again, I have the fondest memories of Miss Maud. Well, I promised you salacious Oxford gossip, and I'm going to run over time, and any of you who need to leave do, but you're going to miss some good stuff. Faulkner is credited with so many sexual affairs that it is surprising he found any time to write. Even though he was only 5'5" and not given to small talk, he had a presence that attracted women. The longest running affair, lasting 16 years with some intermissions, was chronicled by Meta Carpenter Wilde in her tell-all, A Loving Gentleman, published in 1971, after both William and his wife Estelle had died. Meta was often referred to as his Hollywood wife. They first met in Hollywood in 1935 when Faulkner, always in debt, largely due to Estelle's revenge spending, was writing screenplays for MGM. Faulkner professed to hate Hollywood, but he could not resist the money to be made there. And an interesting sidebar to his Hollywood career occurred in 1944 when he wrote the screenplay for To Have and Have Not, based on Hemingway's 1937 novel, and bringing Bogart and Bacall together for the first time in the movie. And this is the only time in film history that 2 Nobel Prize winners have been associated with the same film. On one occasion, Faulkner got permission from a studio head to work at home rather than at the studio. For the studio head, home meant Faulkner's Hollywood apartment. For Faulkner, this meant his office in his Oxford home, Roanoke. That is where the studio had located him. And it seems that his small office at Roanoke was critical to his creative process throughout his life. Faulkner's Hollywood career ended in 1954. And in 1957, and again in 1958, Faulkner served as writer in residence at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. The university, UVA, issued frequent press releases about his Charlottesville presence. In truth, he usually was in Oxford, writing in his Roanoke office and seen every day at the Oxford post office. Again, that little office at Roanoke seemed a haven and a motivator. That's the tell-all I mentioned. This is the office. And the only time I was in the room, which was during daughter Jill's wedding festivities, I was fascinated by the wall on which Faulkner had written in hand using a graphite pencil and a red grease pencil the plot outline for a fable, the novel for which he won the Nobel Prize. It's a story about Holy Week during World War I, if you haven't read it. Faulkner's sexual affairs took on an international account with his trip to Stockholm in 1950 to accept the Nobel Prize. Oxford gossip had it that he initially declined the trip to Stockholm, but was eventually talked into going by daughter Jill, who accompanied him. His wife Estelle did not. The local gossip was that she was not invited. And just as another aside, he was invited to dinner at the White House by the Kennedys when he was in Charlottesville, and he declined, saying that it was a long way to go for a free meal. Once in Stockholm, Faulkner met Elsa Johnson, the recent widow of the man, a reporter, who had introduced Faulkner to Swedish readers and who had promoted Faulkner's award for the Nobel Prize. Their affair lasted until 1953. At the same time, he was having an affair with Memphis novelist Joan Williams, who was 30 years his junior. Close to home, Faulkner's reputation as a lover and womanizer began during his student days at Ole Miss. Although he dropped out of the university after 3 semesters, he remained on campus as the Ole Miss postmaster from 1922 until he resigned in late 1924, saying he had been taken to task by the regional postmaster because he made his own hours at the post office. And Faulkner resigned, saying, "I will be damned if I promise to be at the beck and call of every itinerant scoundrel who has 2 cents to invest in a postage stamp." Well, it was while he was postmaster that he met Ruth Ford at Ole Miss, and I hope I'm going to find Ruth. Yes, there she is. He met her at a place called the Tea Hound, which was the most popular spot for Ole Miss students to socialize at the time. And in the 20s and 30s, they actually attended tea dances, which seemed to be a big deal. So that's where he first met Ruth, who was from the Delta. Well, in addition to having sex with her, she became the inspiration for the character Temple Drake in his breakthrough 1931 novel, Sanctuary. And during her 5 years at Ole Miss, she also dated Faulkner's youngest brother and his eldest nephew. Well, 20 years later, Ruth, now a successful Broadway actress, married to actor Randolph Scott and living in an apartment in the Dakota. the Dakota will be familiar to you because that's where John Lennon was shot, right outside. And Ruth is said to be the first person. She was looking out the window and she was the first person to call 911. She had become good friends with John and Yoko after they moved in 1973. In any event, 20 years later, Ruth, now a successful Broadway actress, um, persuaded Faulkner to let her adapt his 1951 novel, Requiem for a Nun, um, as a stage play. It was a sequel, if you will, to Sanctuary. Ruth reprised her character as Temple Drake. Randolph Scott played the role of her alcoholic uh, comrade from Sanctuary, Gowan Stevens. Now, that name may sound familiar to you. Well, Gowan was the nephew of Gavin, the lawyer, who appeared in 6 of Faulkner's books. And indeed, Gavin also appears in Requiem along with his nephew. As you can see, Faulkner was truly the inventor of literary recycling. Well, the theater party that traveled from Oxford to Broadway did not include Faulkner's wife, Estelle. Incidentally, Requiem is the source of my favorite Faulkner lines. The past is never dead. It's not even past. Well, these lines were later paraphrased by then Senator Barack Obama in his famous 2008 speech, A More Perfect Union. For Faulkner, these lines reflected his belief that the historical events of the past continue to shape the future. Well, I just want to share a little bit more gossip about Ruth Ford because it's an interesting family. Her third cousin, no, her first cousin was another of my military school classmates and my best friend until his recent death. The Fords were not a close and loving family. Another, that particular friend of mine, her cousin, who stayed with her at the Dakota frequently, he reported that on the way to Ruth's mother Gertrude's funeral in the Delta, his father, Gertrude's brother-in-law, remarked, "They should have burned the witch years ago." Gertrude had just been cremated. And when Ruth died in 2009, at the age of 98, and you may have read about this, it was widely reported, she left her $8 million estate entirely to her Asian butler, who's standing in front of the Dakota. She totally disinherited her daughter and grandchildren. So as I say, that just that is always sort of intrigued me. But clearly they were a dysfunctional family. Through all Faulkner's extramarital affairs, Estelle apparently remained faithful to her philandering husband, dying 10 years after her husband in 1972 near their daughter Jill in Virginia. Well, it's fair to say that the Faulkners' marriage was always tempestuous. Although Faulkner had courted her when they were in high school together, her wealthy parents disapproved her marrying an aspiring writer, and in 1918, she married Ole Miss graduate Cornell Franklin, 5 years her senior, and they spent the first 4 years of their marriage in Hawaii before moving to Shanghai. In Shanghai, daughter Victoria, nicknamed Cho-Cho for Madame Butterfly's Cho-Cho son, and son Malcolm were born. And Estelle reportedly hated playing the Southern Belle for her husband there, and she became an alcoholic. A friend of mine who visited him and his second wife during the late 1940s described his walled home in the American concession as a version of Tara. And interestingly, Franklin stayed on after the Chinese Communist Revolution, um, but eventually was granted an exit visa in 1951 and settled in Charlottesville, where his daughter was. Well, not his daughter, his stepdaughter was. I don't know where his daughter and son were at that point. In any event, Shanghai during Estelle's time was so decadent that it was called the whore of Asia. And one American missionary there described Shanghai as, quote, and this is just wonderful, an apology by God to Sodom and Gomorrah. While on home leave with her two children in Oxford in 1926, Faulkner persuaded Estelle to divorce her husband and remain in Oxford. She married Faulkner in 1929. The newlyweds honeymooned in the Mississippi Gulf Coast, where, according to UF's Jim Davis in his recent Pulitzer Prize winning history, The Gulf, said that Estelle tried to drown herself, an act the Oxford gossip somehow missed. The year after their marriage, Faulkner bought the then dilapidated 1844 antebellum home he named Roanoke after two trees, the rowan tree of Scotland, a symbol of peace and serenity, and our southern live oak, a symbol of strength and solitude. And ironically, neither tree has ever grown on the property. But this was Faulkner's forever home. Today, it's a National Historic Landmark, and it's owned by the University of Mississippi and can be visited. In 1931, the Faulkner's first child was born, a daughter named Alabama, who died 10 days after her premature birth. In 1933, daughter Jill, my contemporary, was born and raised at Roanoke along with her half-sister and half-brother. During their married life, Estelle punished William for his affairs with revenge spending, particularly after he spent so much time in Hollywood. It became such a problem that Faulkner published in the Oxford Eagle, the local newspaper, an alert to store owners and clerks that he would not be paying any accounts under his wife's name. In 1962, William Faulkner's lifetime of binge drinking caught up with him, and he died early on the morning of July the 6th, 1962, at the age of 64 at Wright's Sanatorium in Bohemia, Mississippi, near Memphis. I picked the worst photograph I could find because I wanted it to be depressing. What a horrible place to end. Well, although the family, the immediate family, and Wikipedia would have us believe that that thrombosis from a serious injury and a fall from his horse on June the 17th led to his fatal heart attack at home in Oxford, this is far from the truth. It's hard to keep secrets in small towns, and within hours of his death, Faulkner's cousin, Sally Murray Williams, had spread the true story of his death. On July the 5th, Faulkner was indulging in one of his drinking binges, as usual, in his beloved Roanoke office where he had a daybed. A servant kept the mint juleps flowing, and early in the evening, his daughter Jill called from her home horse farm in Charlottesville, asking Pappy to come to Virginia and buy her some adjoining property that had just come on the market. Doing so required sobering up, and Faulkner called a nephew requesting a ride to Wright's Sanatorium in Bohemia, which specialized in the Keeley cure for alcoholism. If you're not familiar with it, this cure relies heavily upon injections of bichlorides or double chlorides of gold. Well, Faulkner's heart could not tolerate the initial injection, and he died in the early hours of that morning. So what a sad end to genius. One more wonderful image. He's buried in St. Peter's Cemetery in Oxford, a few hundred feet from my daughter and my mother and my stepfather. And his tomb quickly became a shrine. Pilgrims from around the world leave votive offerings, usually in the form of Jim Beam and Jack Daniels. So thank you for your attention.
Does anybody have any questions for him? Okay, that's fine if you don't. I'm just curious. Okay, good job. Thank you.
Thank you. How do I, is this the thing right there? Just save it. Well, that wasn't bad.
I thought your voice sounded fine. The
Good.
people on Zoom had problems hearing it.
Oh,
I don't know why.
I don't need.
So we remember mostly booze and suicide.
Thank you for being here.